October 1942, somewhere in the hedgerows of Normandy. A Sherman tank crew crouched behind blasted masonry, shells bursting in the distance. The turret spun slowly, the 75mm gun finally aligned, just in time to pick off a panzer approaching the ridge. But moments wasted. The German tank's 50mm gun crackled first, the shell tearing into the Sherman's frontal plate. In that duel, speed had lost to lethality. For months, Allied tank commanders and crews had complained of one critical flaw: American tanks simply couldn't fire fast enough. In early field trials in North Africa, crews reported that even in quiet sectors, their reload speeds lagged far behind those of Axis counterparts. The Sherman's turret traverse was manual or powered, but sluggish under combat loads, and the loader had to heave 75mm rounds into an awkward breach, often from awkward angles, with limited assist. Against German panzers equipped with faster, higher-velocity guns and more efficient mechanisms, every second mattered. In the European theater, German tank doctrine emphasized quick, brutal strikes. Panzers would burst from cover, snap off an accurate shot, and disappear. In contrast, American doctrine emphasized volume, coordination, and reliability, but when confronted with ambushes, that slower tempo often meant the Sherman crew never got to fire back. Reports from Sicily and Italy in 1943 highlighted this disparity in stark detail. Crews described tense scenes, enemy tanks appearing over ridgelines, firing first, and disappearing before Americans could complete their firing cycle. Mechanics and officers walked through destroyed battlefields where Sherman turrets were still traversing, hatches open, shells half-loaded, evidence of the lag between danger and response. Behind the lines, Army ordnance engineers and the tank destroyer board pored over damage reports, firing logs, and after-action reports. The pattern was undeniable: American tanks were at a firing rate disadvantage, not always in armor or mobility, but in raw speed under combat stress. Communication with tank crews revealed the problem in human terms. A loader would pull a heavy round from a stowage rack, wrestle it into place, snap the breech closed, wait for turret alignment, recenter the sight, then take aim and fire, then reset for the next shot. The entire sequence, if unhurried, might take 8 to 12 seconds in discipline, under fire, more. German tanks, by contrast, were clocked at reload cycles of 5 to 7 seconds under ideal conditions. The Germans had engineered systems, ammo racks positioned for easier access, assisted ramming mechanisms, better turret drives, to accelerate that cycle. At the same time, the Sherman's turret drive system in many early variants was electric motor assisted, but under load and combat stress it lagged or stalled. In field conditions, dirt, debris, and impacts degraded the system's responsiveness. That meant crews sometimes had to revert to manual traverse using hand wheels, the slowest, most frustrating option. Tank commanders like Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams wrote memoranda: "We must match the enemy not in armor alone, but in rate of fire if we are to survive in close tank engagements." In staff rooms in Washington, debates raged. The M4 platform was versatile, reliable, and producible in mass, but its rate of fire limitation was becoming a liability on European battlefields. The Ordnance Board considered higher velocity guns and additional gearing, but replacements for Shermans were in short supply, and upgrades would take months. In the meantime, crews in Europe could only adapt as best they could, drill harder, refine loading techniques, and pray for the first shot edge. In February 1944, during training in England, an experimental platoon attempted a speed cycle test. Crews were timed in mock engagements. The top crew managed a sustained rate of 6 aimed shots per minute, better than previously recorded for American units, but still behind German benchmarks reported from intelligence intercepts. The lesson was clear: even at peak training, American tanks had a fundamental mechanical handicap relative to the best Axis designs. In Normandy, during the first days after D-Day, that lag showed in bloody detail. Sherman units trying to support infantry advances found themselves vulnerable to German armored counterattacks. In some sectors, German panzers slipped through gaps and struck American flanks before US tanks could bring fire to bear. In journals and letters, tank crews described desperation: turn turrets, load round, and by the time the gun bore, the threat was gone or another shell exploded elsewhere. A battalion commander reported, "Our tanks arrive, but they cannot shoot fast enough to protect the infantry on the move. We are vulnerable until we fire. The problem was not just mechanical, it was existential. American tank doctrine assumed that mobility, massed fire, and air support would dominate. But if a Sherman's reload lag allowed a German tank to seize initiative, that doctrine faltered. Getting knocked out before you could shoot back was a fatal design mismatch. In meetings at Fort Knox, engineers and strategists studied captured Panther and Tiger turrets. Those German designs prioritized loading access, turret drive speed, ammunition placement in circular trays, and assisted ramming. One captured Panther turret's internal data showed that its loader rack could swing into place and the round would practically drop into the breech under gravity and leverage, not rested upward as in a Sherman. American engineers began asking, could we adapt those features to our tanks without derailing production? Could we hack the system on the fly rather than redesign entirely? A parallel track emerged. Mechanical engineers proposed auxiliary rammers, improved turret motor gearing, and optimized ammunition racks. But logistics pushed back, limited space, added weight, and cost constraints made many ideas impractical for wartime retrofits. Meanwhile, in the field, a few tank crews quietly began experimenting. They relocated ammo stowage racks closer to the loader's seat, used metal guides to funnel shells into the breech, and practiced motion drills timed to the second, learning to anticipate turret movement, preload shells just before alignment finished, and pre-stage rounds for lightning transfer. These minor hacks shaved fractions of seconds. In the aggregate, crews claimed to reduce reload cycles by up to 20% under ideal conditions. Worth exploring. In spring 1944, before Operation Overlord, Ordnance sent trial Shermans to British test units. They compared standard and field-modified reload configurations. The difference was measurable. Modified rigs tracked 12 to 15% faster cycle times in turret traverse and reload timing. British tank officers quietly observed and relayed the possibility American tanks, properly tuned and crew-coached, might outpace some Axis models in sustained fire volume, even if not in a single rapid shot. In the coming battles in Normandy, the bocage, hedgerows, narrow fields, this kind of sustained edge might be the difference between survival and destruction. The stage was set, the problem no one could ignore had become the imperative. American tanks would need to fire faster not just occasionally, but continuously, under fire. The rest, the hack, the crew drills, the mechanical improved, would follow. February 1944, Central Italy. The 751st Tank Battalion was on the move near Cassino, slogging through muddy roads toward a crumbling village when the lead Sherman was ambushed by two Panzer IVs tucked between olive trees. The gunner yelled, "Target," and the loader scrambled, yanking a 75mm shell from the lower rack. The tank commander screamed, "Traverse left," but it was already too late. The first German shell punched into the Sherman's right side, disabling it instantly. 2 crewmen survived. One of them, Staff Sergeant Carl Dunbar, swore he'd never be caught mid-reload again. The very next day, he and his loader built a modification from scratch that would quietly spread across dozens of tank crews before the army even knew it existed. The fix was simple, brilliant, and completely unauthorized. Dunbar realized that the main problem wasn't the gun itself, it was the layout. In a Sherman, rounds were stored low and behind the loader, meaning precious seconds were lost reaching, turning, lifting, and maneuvering the shell. Worse, the loader had to brace himself against the moving tank to get leverage, especially when the turret was rotating. So Dunbar and his mechanic raided a nearby wrecked P-40 Warhawk fighter. From the fuselage, they salvaged lightweight aluminum framing. From an abandoned jeep, they pulled weathered canvas and scrap steel. Using the tank's own tools, they constructed a swinging ammo rack attached to the inner turret wall, aligned perfectly with the breech. The rack held 4 shells, just enough to sustain rapid firing in the opening seconds of a duel. The loader could now rotate slightly, grab a shell with both hands, and slide it straight into the breech in one smooth motion. They tested it on a hillside, against the burnt remains of a farmhouse. In under 40 seconds, they fired 4 rounds, clean, stable, precise. Their previous record under stress was 2. Word spread fast. Other Sherman crews began copying the design, tweaking it for different turret interiors. Some used salvaged aircraft tubing, others welded with spare armor plate. In one company, a welder created a spring-loaded frame that snapped new rounds forward with minimal effort. These were not official upgrades. They were field hacks, battlefield mods that worked only because crews were desperate to survive. Eventually, Division Command took notice, not from reports, but from results. The crews using these mods were surviving longer, winning more engagements, and landing first shots more often. At a debrief following the Battle of Anzio, an intelligence officer asked Dunbar what his crew had done differently. Dunbar replied, "We stopped waiting on the factory to catch up to the battlefield." That quote reached the desk of Brigadier General Gladion Barnes, head of the Army's Armored Forces Development Division. Barnes sent a team to Italy to investigate. What they found shocked them. Crews across multiple battalions had independently modified their tanks to prioritize reload speed, some even creating foot pedals to rotate the turret slightly during reloading, others repurposing tank radios as internal timers to keep gunner, loader, and commander perfectly in sync. These weren't just hacks. They were grassroots engineering innovations under fire. One officer called it industrial evolution at the barrel's edge. The field engineers reported that crews using such modifications were improving their reload cycles by up to 40%, especially in high-stress ambushes where time was fatal. That figure was impossible to ignore. Rather than reprimand the units, the Army approved a temporary field directive allowing modification to ammunition handling systems at the discretion of command staff. Behind closed doors, they were quietly testing Dunbar's ammo rack for wider adoption. Within 2 months, newer Shermans arriving at forward depots had minor internal layout changes, ammo stowage shifted forward, breech access widened, and rudimentary spring assist racking welded into place. It wasn't a revolution, it was a refinement, sparked by a battlefield hack. And it worked. During the breakthrough at Monte Cassino, American tank units equipped with these mods reported stunning results: 12 enemy armor kills in under 20 minutes during a 3-platoon advance, most of them before German tanks could fire a second shot. In one case, a Sherman crew knocked out 2 Panzer IVs while still moving, reloading on the bounce, a near impossibility before. Veteran tankers began calling it speed loading. The German units didn't understand how the Shermans were suddenly firing twice as fast. Some assumed new guns. Others believed the tanks had more crewmen. But the secret wasn't new weapons, it was repurposed aircraft scrap and an American mechanic with a socket wrench and nothing to lose. What made this modification so effective wasn't just hardware, it was the philosophy behind it. Dunbar and his men had looked at a life-or-death problem, ignored bureaucracy, and solved it with creativity. And unlike top-down redesigns that took months to implement, this one spread in days. Tank crews shared designs on cigarette wrappers. Field manuals began mentioning crew-specific alterations. Engineers embedded with the front lines took measurements, drew schematics, and passed them back to Detroit for post-war consideration. Somewhere along the line, a tank in the 3rd Armored Division received an award for unit performance under armored engagement. The citation didn't mention Dunbar's name or the ammo rack. But every man in the company knew why they were still alive. And by late 1944, most Sherman battalions in France had some form of field-modified loading system, each slightly different, but all faster than standard. The German tanks remained lethal, no doubt. But by the time a Panther lined up its shot, an American tank might already have 2 rounds inbound. That changed everything. Suddenly, the edge wasn't in armor thickness, it was in seconds. In the chess game of armored warfare, the Shermans weren't just moving faster. They were thinking faster. And it started with a genius hack, a length of aluminum pipe, and a loader who got tired of dying while reaching for the next shell. England, spring 1944. On a muddy training range outside Tidworth, a U.S. Army tank crew was being pushed to their limit. Sergeant Andy Brooks barked from the commander's hatch as his crew drilled the same routine over and over again: spot, load, fire, reset. No rounds were live, but their adrenaline burned like combat. A British officer watching nearby noted something unusual: this American crew wasn't just competent, they were fast. Too fast for what he knew of Shermans. Their loader moved like clockwork, the gunner didn't flinch, and the entire crew operated with the rhythm of a well-rehearsed play. There was no yelling, no hesitating, just syncopated efficiency. It wasn't the tank that made them dangerous. It was how they moved inside it. By mid-1944, American tank commanders began to realize something German designers hadn't accounted for: crew choreography could overcome mechanical disadvantages. The Sherman may have lacked the gunpowder of an 88mm or the armor of a Panther, but its interior layout allowed a human advantage: space. Shermans had larger internal compartments than their German rivals, especially the Kramp Panzer IV and Panther. The loader in a Sherman could stand fully upright and swing a shell into the breech without twisting or crouching. Gunners had a clear, uncluttered sight line. The commander could direct the action with crisp clarity. And once crews began practicing synchronized reloading cycles, something clicked. This wasn't just about mechanical speed, it was rhythm. The U.S. Army began standardizing callouts for the loading cycle. A method developed at Fort Knox during tank destroyer drills was quietly spreading to tank battalions in England and France. The sequence was tight and universal. Commander, target front, tank. Gunner, identified. Commander, fire. Gunner, bang. Loader, up. As he slammed the next round into the breech. Gunner, on. Commander, fire. This 6-step cycle repeated every 5 to 7 seconds in combat conditions. No wasted motion. No confusion. The Sherman's weakness, slower traverse, smaller gun, was being neutralized by a crew that acted as one mind. Instructors at the Armored School began using the phrase, battle rhythm, in training lectures. Each crew position was now seen not as a job, but as a note in a song. The loader didn't wait for the shot to fire, he prepped on the gunner's breath. The commander didn't shout orders, he sang them in tempo. The gunner didn't wait for the order, he anticipated it like a jazz musician hitting his cue. And crucially, the Sherman's design made this coordination possible. German tanks often relied on individual precision. The gunner was isolated, the loader cramped, the commander overloaded with duties. It worked well in training. But under pressure, coordination broke down. In contrast, American doctrine emphasized crew interdependence. Tank crews trained together, ate together, lived together. By D-Day, most veteran Sherman crews had fought together since Sicily. Their timing wasn't rehearsed, it was instinct. One commander in the 2nd Armored Division described his loader as, not a man, but a metronome. In the Battle of St. Lo, his crew fired 9 rounds in 65 seconds, knocking out 2 German half-tracks and pinning a third before it could reverse. We weren't faster than them, he wrote later, we were tighter. Like gears meshing under pressure. That was the secret. Even tank destroyers like the M10 Wolverine, which were slower to aim and reload due to their open turret design, began using Sherman-style coordination cycles. Some crews went so far as to drill in silence, using hand gestures and finger taps to simulate gunfire timing. Others painted symbols inside the turret, small markers, so that loaders could align their hands and body without looking away from the shell. Nothing in the manual explained this. It was all muscle memory, born of shared danger. And the effects were measurable. In a comparative study done by British liaison officers, American crews operating Shermans could achieve effective fire, that is, shot on target and ready to reload, nearly 30% faster than the German crews they faced, who often paused between cycles for communication or sight adjustments. In one case from Operation Cobra, a Sherman crew engaged and destroyed 3 Panzer IVs in under 2 minutes, not because their gun was better, but because their cycle was unbroken. What emerged from these observations was a realization that the tank itself didn't win duels, the crew did. And that victory came not from armor thickness or gun length, but from timing. The Germans had better math. The Americans had better music. By the fall of 1944, some Sherman units were so tightly coordinated that they began experimenting with fire, volleys, multiple tanks firing in sequence, timed to saturate an area every 3 seconds. This created the illusion of greater numbers, overwhelming German positions with relentless impact. It wasn't always accurate. But it didn't need to be. The tempo broke nerves. After the war, U.S. military analysts began codifying these lessons into doctrine. Tank crew training shifted from gunnery emphasis to crew timing and flow. Modern tanks like the M48 Patton and later the M1 Abrams owe much of their crew compartment layout and fire cycle philosophy to those early Sherman crews and their battlefield ballet. In the end, what made American tanks faster wasn't a better engine or a stronger shell. It was 4 men in a steel box who knew each other's movements like breathing. The war didn't teach them that. The war merely revealed it. And in that revelation, the Sherman became something greater than the sum of its parts, a machine that fired not with gears and hydraulics, but with heartbeat and harmony. France, August 1944. Near the village of Mortain, American armored units were under pressure. German forces had launched a desperate counteroffensive to break through the narrowing Falaise pocket, hoping to trap and destroy Allied forces pushing east. Amid fog, rain, and chaos, an unlikely advantage surfaced, one hidden in the mechanics of the Sherman's turret. It wasn't the gun. It wasn't the armor. It was the speed at which the turret could move. American tanks were turning and firing faster than any of their counterparts. And that advantage was built on a secret not everyone understood at the time: power traverse. Most people think the deadliest moment in a tank duel is the trigger pull, but in truth, it's the seconds just before. The time it takes to turn your turret, aim, and shoot. German tanks like the Panther and Tiger boasted fearsome firepower and thick armor, but their turret drives were either electric or hand-cranked. The Panther's electric traverse motor was effective on flat terrain and with the engine running at optimal RPM, but slow to respond under stress. The Tiger I had a hydraulic system tied to its engine, meaning the turret traverse rate varied depending on engine speed. At idle, turning the turret 360 degrees could take over a minute. Under battlefield pressure, with engines throttled down to reduce detection, that delay was lethal. Now contrast that with the Sherman. Starting with the M4A1 and later refined in the M4A3 variants, American tanks featured a stabilized, power-assisted traverse system that was independent of engine throttle. At the heart of this was the Oil-Gear Power Traverse Unit, a compact hydraulic mechanism adapted from U.S. Navy destroyer turrets. It allowed the Sherman's gunner to rotate the turret smoothly and consistently, regardless of terrain or engine output. Full 360-degree rotation. 15 seconds flat, even under combat conditions. In Normandy hedgerows or the narrow streets of St. Lo, this mattered. A Sherman could respond to threats from the flank, spin toward a sudden target, and snap off a shot before a German tank had even completed its manual swing. American crews learned to use this aggressively. If they spotted a Panther, they didn't wait. They turned, fired, reversed, repositioned, all within seconds. German crews often reported being hit before they finished aiming. At the Battle of Aricourt in September 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Clark's Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division faced off against a superior German force equipped with Panthers and Panzer IVs. It should have been a slaughter. Instead, the Americans ambushed the Germans repeatedly in low visibility, spinning their turrets rapidly, striking from angles the German gunners couldn't match. Clark later noted that, "Our ability to get the first shot off saved hundreds of lives." Reports from his units revealed that Shermans were often able to re-aim and fire again while Panthers were still cranking toward their original bearing. One specific case stood out. Near the town of Juvilliers, a single Sherman platoon encountered a flanking move by 3 Panthers. As the Panthers opened fire, the lead Sherman spun its turret left, lined up its shot in under 2 seconds, and fired a high-velocity armor-piercing round. The German tank never got its turret fully aligned. 2 more Panthers were destroyed in the following minute, not because they were outgunned, but because they were outmaneuvered. Power traverse didn't just help in tank duels. It also allowed American tanks to react more quickly to threats from infantry, hidden guns, or anti-tank teams. In urban combat, where angles changed by the second, Sherman crews could sweep alleys, windows, and cross streets faster than any tank in the European theater. One gunner in the 3rd Armored Division said, "I could swing my turret faster than you could whistle for help." He wasn't wrong. German commanders began reporting that American tanks seemed unnaturally fast in response time. Some suspected new technology. Others blamed tactics. Few realized it was the hydraulic power traverse doing the work silently behind the scenes. While German tanks relied on strength, American tanks relied on speed. And it paid off. To be clear, the Sherman's gun wasn't as powerful as the German 75mm or 88mm high-velocity weapons. In a straight shootout, the Panther or Tiger could still destroy a Sherman with a single shot from over 1,000 yards. But that rarely happened. Most duels happened at closer ranges, 300 yards, sometimes less, and in those moments, the Sherman's quick aim could mean everything. The crew that fired first often won. Post-war studies confirmed this. In U.S. Army ballistic research after 1945, analysts examined tank duels across Europe. In over 60% of cases, the tank that fired first survived, regardless of caliber. The same reports noted that American tanks, specifically the M4A3 with power traverse, were consistently faster to align their shots by critical margins. Turret spin time, once seen as a minor detail, was now recognized as a defining trait of survival. Even the Soviets took note. During Lend-Lease evaluations, Red Army officers praised the Sherman's traverse system. One famously said it turned like a dancer, not a drunk, in comparison to the T-34's stiff manual gear. The genius of this hack wasn't an accident, it was engineering foresight. Designers in America had understood early on that speed wasn't just about how fast you drove. It was about how fast you thought and reacted. The turret traverse, though less glamorous than armor or firepower, became the Sherman's secret weapon. It let American crews dictate the tempo, outturn ambushes, and win fights they otherwise had no business surviving. And in a war where seconds meant the difference between burning alive or living to fight another day, that hydraulic whisper inside the Sherman's turret might have been the loudest advantage of all. Belgium, December 1944. Snow blanketed the forests of the Ardennes as the Battle of the Bulge erupted in its full fury. American tank crews, cold, tired, and surrounded, were thrown into one of the most intense armored clashes of the war. German Panthers, Tigers, and Jagdpanzer IVs pushed through narrow roads, knocking out Allied armor with brutal efficiency. The U.S. Shermans, already outgunned and lightly armored in comparison, had to rely on anything they could find to survive. And in this frozen hell, one seemingly small innovation made a massive difference: the gun stabilizer. To the average soldier, stabilizers were invisible. But to a Sherman gunner, they were the edge between a bouncing shot and a dead-on hit. Introduced as early as 1942 but rarely understood, the vertical stabilizer in the M4 Sherman allowed the main gun to remain relatively on target even as the tank moved. This meant that American tanks didn't have to stop completely to fire accurately, unlike most of their German counterparts, which had no such system. Initially, many U.S. crews didn't trust the stabilizers. In early models, the system was finicky. It required careful calibration and maintenance, and poorly trained operators often disabled it altogether. But as training improved and new production runs refined the mechanics, crews began to realize what they had. By 1944, Sherman units deploying into France and Belgium had been drilled not only in how to use the stabilizer but how to maximize it tactically. A stabilized gun wasn't a miracle, it didn't let you snipe on the move. But it meant you could track and aim while rolling, so that when the tank did stop, even briefly, the gun was already lined up. A German Panther, by comparison, had to halt, stabilize, align, and then fire, a sequence that could take precious seconds. In a tank duel, that delay was deadly. One veteran from the 11th Armored Division recalled an engagement near Bastogne. We were moving at full crawl through trees. Snow everywhere. Saw the flash of a Panther's muzzle ahead. My driver pivoted, I already had the gun on him thanks to the stabilizer. Fired one shot, hit the side turret clean. If we'd had to stop and swing, we'd be gone. That kind of quick reaction wasn't luck. It was a byproduct of a system most enemy crews didn't even know the Sherman had. What made this stabilizer so ahead of its time was its simplicity. The system wasn't computerized, it used a gyroscopic mechanism connected to a hydraulic control. When engaged, it allowed vertical control of the gun to compensate for tank movement. The gunner could ride the terrain, aiming and adjusting continuously, rather than resetting after every bump. And with time, gunners learned to ride the stabilizer like a wave, timing their shot with the moment of minimal sway. This mattered enormously in bad weather, bad terrain, or surprise situations. German tanks, though superior on paper, were often optimized for open-field combat. Their optics were superb, but useless if the gun couldn't stay on target while moving. In contrast, the Sherman became the tank of opportunity. Charge a hill, roll through rubble, pivot into a field, and fire on the roll. That kind of movement kept crews alive. Not all Sherman units used the stabilizer perfectly. Some still preferred the old method: halt, aim, fire. But the units that did embrace it began outperforming others in tank-on-tank engagements. During Operation Nordwind in January 1945, one armored battalion equipped with M4A3, 76W Shermans used stabilizers in coordinated rolling fire assaults. Reports showed that their hit probability on first shots rose by 20% compared to earlier campaigns, even under poor visibility. They weren't just surviving longer, they were hitting more, faster, and from unexpected angles. The Germans noticed. Radio intercepts from Wehrmacht tank units began referring to American tanks firing before they should. Some commanders dismissed it as aggression. Others suspected American crews had superior optics. But the truth was simpler: while German tanks were still setting up, Shermans had already drawn, aimed, and fired. In field modifications, some units even upgraded their stabilizer performance with tighter calibration, cleaning routines, and replacement of worn hydraulic seals. Gunners began carrying extra lubricants and wrenches not for the engine, but for the gyroscope. That's how critical it had become. In some cases, they even shared spare parts between tanks mid-battle. If a stabilizer failed, priority was given to restoring it before any other turret function. By the end of the war, the value of stabilization had been fully proven. Post-war NATO doctrine incorporated stabilization as a requirement for all new tank designs. The Soviets, observing captured Shermans, quickly realized the implications and accelerated development of similar systems. And the US, learning from its own improvisation, built future tanks like the M26 Pershing and M48 Patton with full gun stabilization as a core feature, not an afterthought. In retrospect, the Sherman stabilizer was one of the earliest examples of battlefield automation, not full control, but enhanced reaction. It made American tanks feel faster not by driving faster, but by thinking faster. The moment a target appeared, the Sherman's gun was already in motion, like a reflex. The Germans never caught up, not because they didn't have the technology, but because they didn't think to make it a priority. So when people ask why the Sherman, a tank so often mocked for being undergunned and underarmored, managed to win so many battles, the answer lies not in brute force, but in tiny mechanisms. Gyroscopes. Hydraulics. Training. The ability to shoot second but hit first. The stabilizer didn't make the Sherman invincible. It just made it ready. And in the cold forests of Belgium, that readiness meant everything. Germany, March 1945. The war was nearing its end, but the fight was still vicious. Near the town of Remagen, a group of American Shermans rolled across the Ludendorff Bridge, one of the last standing crossings over the Rhine. German defenses knew it was a last stand, and anti-tank weapons were everywhere, Panzerfaust teams in basements, Pak-40 guns buried in roadside hedgerows. It was here that one final edge in the Sherman's arsenal showed itself, not a mechanical upgrade or a factory innovation, but a logistical miracle: the ability to keep firing, longer, faster, and more reliably than nearly any other tank on the continent. At the heart of this advantage was ammunition supply. Throughout the war, American tank units were supported by a logistical machine unlike anything the Germans could muster. Dedicated ammo carriers, pre-packed shell crates, and decentralized forward depots meant Sherman crews rarely had to wait for rearmament. In contrast, German tank units were often hampered by limited fuel, delayed shell deliveries, and disrupted transport lines. A Panther might have a powerful gun, but if it was out of AP shells, or had only a handful, it became a mobile bunker. American tanks, on the other hand, not only had ample ammunition but improved loadouts. By 1944, tank crews were customizing their shell types for different threats: high-explosive rounds for infantry and buildings, armor-piercing for enemy tanks, white phosphorus for smoke and psychological shock. This allowed U.S. tankers to fire quickly and effectively across varied targets, without waiting to request specialty rounds. They carried what they needed because the system allowed them to. The Sherman could carry more than 90 rounds of 75mm or 76mm ammunition, more than the Panther or Tiger, whose cramped turrets and thick armor limited internal stowage. And with the introduction of wet stowage systems, where shells were housed in water-jacketed bins to reduce the risk of fire, American crews could pack even more ammo with less risk. This dramatically cut the chances of catastrophic explosions when a Sherman was hit, and also encouraged crews to stay in the fight longer rather than bailing at the first sign of trouble. But it wasn't just about the rounds themselves. The speed at which they could be delivered to tanks on the front line became a critical factor. American quartermasters developed ammo relay teams, jeep drivers, light trucks, even half-tracks loaded with shells who followed behind tank columns and resupplied them in the field. Some Shermans modified their engine decks with brackets to carry extra crates. In some armored divisions, gunners and loaders developed a rhythm not just for firing, but for refilling the turret racks mid-battle. One Sherman crew in the 9th Armored Division was documented pulling ammo directly from their rear deck bins while engaging enemy tanks across a field in the Ruhr. That was the genius. American tanks didn't just fire faster during battle, they rearmed faster afterward. German tanks that survived a duel might sit idle for hours waiting for the next supply column to catch up, if it wasn't bombed on the way. But a Sherman crew could be back in action in under 20 minutes, often without leaving their immediate sector. Some even coordinated with nearby infantry who helped pass rounds from supply vehicles to the tank's turret hatch. In the final months of the war, these micro-advantages became decisive. At Remagen, during the battle to expand the bridgehead, one tank battalion fired over 2,000 rounds in 48 hours, far beyond what German units could manage. Gunners reported, never being short on what we needed. The German defenders, meanwhile, were reduced to counting shells, conserving shots, and even firing captured ammo when compatible. In one desperate instance, a Panther was found abandoned, not because it was hit, but because it had run dry. The gun was fine. The crew simply couldn't reload. All of this tied back into the central theme of American tank combat: firing first, firing fast, and firing often. While German tanks waited for ammunition or cautiously conserved it, Shermans kept up the pressure. In a war of attrition, that mattered. A tank that could fight twice in one day was worth more than a tank that could kill in one shot and then sit useless for 6 hours. The logistical brilliance behind Sherman operations wasn't glamorous. There were no big parades for the ammo truck drivers or supply depot officers. But they made the tank what it was: a fast, adaptable, always ready weapon. In the final push through Germany, as towns fell and bridges collapsed, the true power of the Sherman wasn't just its gun, or its turret, or even its stabilizer, it was its sustainability. The ability to fire again. And again. And again. When the dust settled, and Allied forces rolled into shattered German cities, many would look at the Sherman and ask how such an inferior tank beat giants like the Tiger. The answer, in part, sat in the quiet supply lines that never stopped moving, the crews that never ran dry, and the understanding that sometimes, the best weapon isn't the one with the biggest bullet, but the one that never runs out.